Sponsored by Wondrium. Imagine you're an ancient Egyptian, and you're sailing up the Nile from the delta to the cataracts that mark the boundary with ancient Nubia. The year is somewhere around 1200 BCE. As you round a bend in the river, on the left bank you'd see the sun rising through a series of enormous stone gateways, one behind the other, as well as gold-tipped obelisks sparkling with the early morning light. This is Karnak, the greatest temple complex in all of ancient Egypt, and at one time, one of the tallest structures in the entire world. On your right, across the river, you'd see pharaonic mortuary temples nestled among the cliffs, guarding the famous Valley of the Kings, a necropolis of pharaonic tombs cut into the rock. Among these temples are scattered all the other features of a major city: marketplaces, docks, palaces, and houses of all sizes. But it's the temples that dominate the skyline. Their gates, made of two stone towers on either side of the entryway, gave the city its common nickname: 100-gated Thebes. With an estimated population of somewhere between 40,000 and 75,000 people, Thebes was one of the largest, if not the largest city in the world for more than a millennium, from about 1900 to 700 BCE. It was known throughout the ancient world as a place of breathtaking grandeur and incomprehensible wealth. For centuries, Thebes was home to Egypt's most influential rulers, and most notably, its most powerful gods, especially Amun, the king of gods, and the patron god of his holy city. But what was so special about Thebes? Why did Egypt's greatest city spring up along an unremarkable stretch of the Nile in Upper Egypt to grow into a religious and cultic hub? And what can its architecture tell us about the religion and society that flourished here for centuries? To understand the city of Thebes, let's start with the name. Confusingly, Thebes is also an ancient city in Greece. So why the same name? The answer is, no one really knows. But it's what the Greeks called both cities as far back as the first millennium BCE in the works of Homer. But apparently this was only a Greek thing, because in the ancient Egyptian language, the city was originally called Waset, which probably meant that it was the location of the Was scepter, an important symbol of power carried by both kings and gods. As the city grew, its proper name gradually fell out of use. Later Akkadian and Hebrew sources identify the city as No, or No Amun, and that same name survives into the Coptic language as Ne. These names all derive from an Egyptian word which simply means city. Much like the way New Yorkers might refer to New York City simply as the city, Egyptians referred to their most prominent city as simply the city, and the Egyptian word for city became its name. And Thebes indeed was the quintessential example of what that word represented, as the center of Egyptian religion, culture, and politics for much of pharaonic history. Let's zoom back now to the beginnings of Thebes, before it became known as the city. Historians of ancient Egypt have broken its timeline down into periods, seen here on screen, and while scholars debate some of the precise transitions between each of these periods, these give us a good look at the different phases of Egyptian history, each with their own political, economic, and social dynamics. Now, we don't know much about the very earliest days of Thebes, but given the overall evidence for human settlement in Egypt dating back tens of thousands of years, and based on Paleolithic stone tools found at the site, we can reasonably assume that people lived on the spot for thousands of years before it became the center of Egypt's most powerful rulers and gods. Until the first intermediate period, Thebes was probably little more than a moderately sized village on the Nile, just one among many nondescript towns in Upper Egypt. But ever since its rise beginning in the Middle Kingdom, Thebes has never been uninhabited. Today it's known as Luxor, from the Arabic word meaning the castles, a reference to the many pharaonic temples that are still scattered throughout the city and landscape. As a result, much of ancient Thebes has since been buried by centuries and centuries of continuous building. Whatever archaeological evidence there might be for the origins of the city probably lies underneath the modern houses of the people who still live there today. But on the other side of the river, the Theban hills are a honeycomb of ancient tombs, some of which date back to the Old Kingdom. This means that local nobles had established Thebes as their base of power long before it became the economic, religious, and political center of the Egyptian state in later eras. The major shift happened during the first intermediate period. For reasons that historians don't fully understand, the centralized government that built the pyramids, now known as the Old Kingdom, collapsed around 2160 BCE. Egypt had no central government for a period lasting about a century. Local rulers gained autonomy over their surrounding regions and no longer had to answer to a pharaoh in a far-off capital. One of these rulers, Intef of Thebes, had ambitions. Intef began attacking his neighbors to the north in an effort to bring their territory under his control. Now, Intef himself would never see Egypt reunited, but one of his descendants, Mentuhotep II, did finally conquer all of Egypt, ushering in the Middle Kingdom. Mentuhotep II made Thebes the capital of a newly united Egypt, the first but not the last time that the city would serve this role. Later dynasties moved the capital away from Thebes, but despite this temporary setback, Thebes was still on the rise. During the Second Intermediate Period, a new set of local rulers grew strong enough to launch yet another war of unification. Theban rulers once again reunited all of Egypt into a single centralized government. This so-called New Kingdom was a golden age of ancient Egypt, and nowhere was this more evident than in Thebes. Basically, all of the biggest and most impressive sites that tourists visit in Luxor today are New Kingdom sites. Most notably, the Karnak Temple Complex. And here's why I call Thebes a holy city, on par with other holy cities like Jerusalem, Mecca, or Varanasi. Karnak was already an impressive place of worship and pilgrimage long before the New Kingdom, perhaps as far back as the Old Kingdom. But when Mentuhotep II rose to power, he set a previously minor deity on the road to superstardom, Amun. His name means the Hidden One. By this time, Amun was the patron god of Thebes. His mysterious, transcendent nature made him especially appealing to the broader population, even though he doesn't seem to have been worshipped widely during the Old Kingdom. But Middle Kingdom pharaohs began focusing the worship of Amun in Thebes by building or continuing to build the Temple of Amun, which is the central component of the Karnak Temple complex. This laid the groundwork for a religious revolution and set Thebes on a course to become not just the capital of ancient Egypt, but the holy city of Egypt, the cultic center of Egypt's most important god, though it would take centuries for it to fully develop during the New Kingdom. During this era, Karnak ballooned in size as subsequent pharaohs built new structures and expanded its boundaries. And this is why I keep saying Karnak Temple Complex instead of just Karnak Temple, because it's not a single building, but rather a massive precinct consisting of an agglomeration of obelisks, satellite temples, small shrines and chapels, gateways, colossal statues, and even a sacred lake, all constructed over the course of 2,000 years by many different pharaohs. If you wanted to show your patronage and connection to Amun, you'd expand or renovate the Karnak Temple complex, maybe by building another obelisk or chapel. Although Amun was the most important god worshipped there, at least for most of its history, several other gods were worshipped within the complex as well, including the Theban war god Montu, as well as Amun's wife, the mother goddess Mut, and their son, the moon god Khonsu, made famous by the Marvel version Khonshu and Marvel's Moon Knight. Together they formed the Theban triad. The most impressive part of the complex, at least to modern visitors, is the Great Hypostyle Hall. That tiny dot here on screen is me. This hall is huge. The Great Hypostyle Hall reached its full height during the 19th dynasty, and even today it towers 25 meters over the city. Once it was the tallest building in Thebes, and in a sense, one of the tallest buildings in the entire world, at least as we usually understand the concept of building. Pyramids are taller, but unlike pyramids, which are almost entirely solid throughout and rise at a gently sloping angle, the Hypostyle Hall is rectangular and uses columns to support a flat stone roof. Building technologies have changed in the last 3,000 years since it was built, so we routinely visit much taller buildings today, but the scale of the Hypostyle Hall was unlike anything else in the ancient world. We can only imagine how impossibly huge it must have seemed. In a city where most human-made structures were probably mud brick houses, staring up at such grandeur, it's easy enough to understand the message the building was trying to convey. Amun is supreme. He lives in the most magnificent palace ever constructed, and the pharaoh who honors him is the most powerful person in the world. The power of the pharaoh may wax and wane, but the solid stone palace of Amun will endure for all time. And as often the case in the history of religion, here's where things get political. It's not a stretch to call Karnak a political institution in ancient Egypt. Not only did the architecture of Karnak communicate the power of Amun, and by association the power of the pharaohs, but the myths created around Amun and the rituals conducted at Karnak also reinforced the king's legitimacy to rule. So, for example, the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty depicted Amun as the progenitor of the pharaohs, and the one who selected them to rule. The pharaohs even built a hall where coronation rituals were conducted with the god's approval. Quite an explicit example of the entanglement of religion and politics. The coronation of new pharaohs literally took place within the walls of Karnak. Now, all of this amounts to the religion of the super elite in Thebes, the pharaohs, nobles, and priests. In fact, the common folk had very limited access to the Karnak temple complex, if at all. But the public would have witnessed major rituals throughout the year because the entire city of Thebes basically became an enormous parade ground for annual festivals that crossed the main part of the city from Karnak to Luxor Temple, and even across the Nile, passing by the temples of previous pharaohs on the west bank, and then crossing the river again to the harbor at Karnak. In some of these festivals, such as the Opet festival, the gold figure of the god Amun was removed from the inner sanctum of Karnak and placed in a shrine aboard a small boat. Priests carried the boat on their shoulders around the temple grounds, through the southern pylon to the Temple of Mut, and further on to Luxor Temple, leading it back and forth all the way through the city on a processional road lined with sphinxes. This road still survives today, and in 2021, the modern Egyptian President Sisi marched down the road during a ceremony with 400 performers dressed in ancient Egyptian costumes. So even today you can glimpse the political utility of the Theban processional road. The general population was able to view this procession from the riverbanks. They would have witnessed a huge entourage of elite priests, government officials, and soldiers, crisscrossing the city, carrying with them the patron god of the city and the pharaoh, while singing hymns to both of them. The Yale University Egyptologist John Darnell argues that the Opet festival was a renewal ceremony, the result of which was the renewal of Amun in the person of his ever-renewing human vessel, the reigning king. In other words, the festival's purpose was to reconfirm the royal coronation of the pharaoh, which has special significance when performed in front of the general population of the city. And the Opet festival must have been deeply embedded in the local culture. Not only was it celebrated all the way into the Roman period, some scholars have argued that echoes of the festival may have survived in Coptic Christian and Islamic celebrations too. So what happened to Karnak in later years? The golden age of the New Kingdom eventually declined. You'd think this meant the sun had finally set on the centrality of Amun and the political power of Karnak, but you'd be wrong. Scholars have argued that the Third Intermediate Period was actually a time of delicately balanced power, rather than disunity. Instead of widespread strife, rule over Egypt was shared between an officially recognized pharaoh in the Delta and the high priest of Amun in Thebes. In other words, the leader of Karnak had become the equivalent of a pharaoh in Upper Egypt. In practical terms, Egypt was amicably divided between two kings, one of them still residing in Thebes and leading the worship of Amun, a Theban theocracy, if you will. Central to this balance was the belief in Amun as king of gods. Despite his name, Amun was not a god hidden from view except on festival occasions. Worshipping him had become a matter of personal piety. At the same time, he had come to be seen as a king both in a theological sense and in the very practical sense of uniting and guiding the two rulers who cooperated to govern the country. Belief in Amun during this time was so widespread and so influential that even non-Egyptians came to worship him. The kingship of Amun was not to last forever, though. In 663 BCE, Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, invaded Egypt and sacked the city of Thebes, looting much of the temple's wealth. This marked the beginning of the end for Karnak as one of the greatest sacred precincts in the world. Later, Alexander the Great and the Ptolemies did build new monuments in the space, but Karnak would never again reach the heights of power it enjoyed in earlier centuries. But Thebes didn't disappear. It remained inhabited to this day, and now survives as the thriving city of Luxor, home to over 400,000 Egyptians and one of the top destinations for tourists today. Though devotion to Amun may have waned, and I'd guess that no future kings will be buried in the Valley of the Kings, the monumental ruins of Karnak that still stand in the middle of Luxor are a testament to the centuries that Thebes stood as the holy city of ancient Egypt. Thanks to Wondrium for sponsoring today's video. Wondrium is a video subscription service that features over 6,000 hours of video courses, documentaries, and series led by trusted experts and nonfiction storytellers. I love Wondrium because they take the academic study of religion seriously. They offer series on Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Confucianism, and more. They offer series on the archaeology of the Bible, Norse mythology, and the philosophy of religion. A truly impressive library. Religion is a tough topic for any company to tackle, but Wondrium has brought in a whole cadre of real academics, college professors from top universities to teach these courses, and I'm continually impressed. And they're always adding new content too. So, for example, this month on November 25th, they're launching a new series called In the Footsteps of the Historical Jesus, a 15-part series that digs into the life and cultural context of Jesus of Nazareth. The series will be filmed on location in Israel, Jordan, and Egypt, and will also cover the early growth of Christianity, including the Gnostic movement that flourished in Egypt. So stay tuned for that. Wondrium is offering a free trial to the Religion for Breakfast audience. Head on over to wondrium.com/religionforbreakfast to sign up, or click the link in the comments below.